I've had a look at this PRO-101 mainboard and I can't really find the problem, so I've decided to not carry on attempting to look at the mainboard and concentrate instead on making a new PCB to fit in this space. So there's plenty of room there. I'm going to use the display from either this, although I think I'm going to leave this board as it is, put the ICs back in and so on. Maybe do a little bit more work attempting to fix it, but I think there's something terminal with this board. So anyway, I'm going to make a new PCB to replace this. So I'm going to use a display like this, and the rest of the board will actually be new. So there'll be a Pico on there and drivers for the display, and I probably won't use a power socket like this because the Pico should be able to run everything over USB, so maybe a USB cable can come out of there or maybe here, and that will give me a power solution. I'm going to put in battery connectors. I'm going to try and remake these hopefully, and put a battery circuit here so you could run it off batteries if you wanted to, and then use the original keyboard. The keyboard's fine for this. There's nothing wrong with it, I don't think. There's a little bit of corrosion but nothing major. And yeah, that's the plan. And then this will stay original, so someone in the future could fix it if they wanted to. If more information came to light, you could replace some of the ICs maybe, but I think these ICs are actually, I think it's probably this one. I suspect battery corrosion's got up the legs of this IC, and that's the one that's gone. And unless you can find a PRO-101 which is in a really bad state but this IC is working, I think that's probably it. So the other PRO-101 I looked at, basically it worked, it's just that the RAM down here wasn't working, so that was sort of obvious that if you could replace the RAM the whole thing would work, which it did. So that was a different sort of failure altogether. This is just completely dead. So anyway, that's the plan. So new PCB to replace this, and then because I haven't got a ROM dump for it, and even if I did have dumps, I'm not entirely sure what the processor is, or even if it's got a processor. Could be a state machine or something like that. I'm going to have to recreate the code as a simulation of this calculator from scratch, so that's going to be interesting. Quite a lot of work as well, I think. The main PCB for the PRO-101's turned up. It's got a VFD display, which will be a 201-202 type display, which is the same one as the PRO-101's got. It's got a filament driver there for the VFD. Serial shift register drivers here, MAX 6921. Step up supply for the VFD, Raspberry Pi Pico, linear regulator for the battery supply, and then some resistors and so on. And I'm using these two chips. There's 40 outputs on these two chips. I'm using them to drive the VFD and also to drive things like the keyboard scanning and the LEDs and so on. I'm going to step the voltage down to make it compatible with the Raspberry Pi Pico. So that'll be 3.3, probably run it at 3.3 rather than 5 because I can. And that means I don't have to put any extra GPIO expansion on there to get keyboard scanning and so on. It's a bit tricky though, because the voltage you got here determines the voltage dividers to give you 3.3 volts on the Raspberry Pi Pico, so you've got to get that working before you can work out the values for these resistors. So that's the original board, and it does the same thing, but really the only common component is the display, because that's the bit you see. I'm going to have to make some battery clips here if I'm going to get that working as well. A populated one. So that is the same PCB in the PRO-101 rear half of the case, and that works quite nicely. Had a few false starts for various reasons. but if I power that up, so this is running off USB. I've got the 3.3 volts coming out of the Pico and going into the step-up supply for the VFD, and that's okay because this is all quite low current. VFDs are low current displays, low power displays really as well, sort of, and that means I can run it off the USB, which is nice. So the USB will power everything up. And you can see I've got some, or can you? Yeah, I've got some zeros followed by some digits there, you can see them. And that is generated by the Pico if I didn't have any code on the Pico. So if I start it up in boot mode, nothing will happen because it'll be sitting there in mass storage mode. But if I boot that up, let's shade that. It comes up with zeros because that's zeros in the buffer, and then it puts some digits in. So I'm running this at 16-ish volts here because when I tried 20, the Pico regulator didn't work, and I want it running off USB. That's quite nice, rather than having to have batteries in there all the time. And I think that's about the same brightness as my 201. I'll have to check. I do have the options on this board of running the step-up supply from batteries, so I can try that if it isn't bright enough. I ran it at 13 originally because I didn't have the right capacitors, and it was quite a lot dimmer than this, but this looks about right, so I'll probably go with that. Let's power it down and put the keyboard on. So if we connect that in there, I've had to make the Pico lower actually, so this is a different mounting arrangement. This is actually cut down pin headers into an IC socket, and that is much lower and is a much better fit. Well anyway, actually the display, the keyboard doesn't work, the display does, but if I do that, you can see how bright it is through the filter. If I power it up, you see that's sort of what you'd expect from a VFD calculator. It's quite bright. These aren't working at the moment. I haven't written the code for that, and I don't have the resistor dividers in there, so I can't write the code. So I need to work out the values that I'm going to use to divide down the VFD driver chip to get my 3.3-ish, probably 3.1 or 3.2 volts. Depends what resistor values I can use. And then it should work as a calculator. Then I've got to do the code, and that's sort of coming on. I've got libraries and things to do the code, so I do have code which will work with 1 times 10 to the plus or minus 99, and internally it uses 200 digits of resolution, so that's going to work. I think I've got most of that going, and a little bit of things like I can write a very short program and run it and things like that. But I need to get all the switches and buttons working now, and the LEDs and all that sort of stuff. And because I've driven that off the VFD driver as a GPIO expanders really, because there's very few GPIOs on the Pico, I've got to put all these chips on there. So that's the next job. I've got a bit more working. I've populated, I think, most of the board, if not all the board that I'm going to populate. There's some options that I'm not going to populate, things like filament drive. I had an alternative way of doing it, and I'm not going to do that. Got some LEDs here, so there's some life in the LEDs. I can actually get 3 of the LEDs lighting. At the moment there's only a couple going on. These outside 2 I can't get to illuminate, but I'm not sure why at the moment. Could be my code, could be the board layout, not really sure. I think the VFD, I can get all digits, all segments up and running. This is being scanned at the moment. The keyboard, I do have USB output on some of these keys, and I think at the moment that looks sort of okay. And similarly, this switch, I can get most most of the settings. I can't get 0 and 1 at the moment, and I haven't looked at these switches, but they look sort of okay as well. They're getting scanned from partially the VFD driver, like the keyboard, that's VFD driver, and then it goes into the Pico. So the voltage dividers are working on that. I've divided down to about 2.7 volts from the 16.4 that I'm running the VFD at, and that all seems to work. So I think now it's just sort of find out these little things like why those two LEDs aren't lighting, check the switches, check the keyboard, and I think the hardware, I mean there might need to be some changes, but at the moment there are no modifications on there. The only thing I've done is sort of fix some resistor values. But it's getting very close to being a calculator. I mean, we're almost there. I need to put some key scanning in, do some proper debounce and things on that, and then just work on the code, really.